Welcome to Through Ancient Eyes. This is where I will share unexpected insights about the ancient Near East culture to uncover how much better God is compared to any other power that we might ever try to put our hope and our trust in. I'm Gail Heaton, and since this is our first time together, let me say welcome. So, what I want to do is give you a better understanding of the culture in which the Torah was given. Because I think that if you know what the ancients were up against based on their cultural needs, that you can get a better sense of how God met them exactly where they needed to. And then when you do that, you'll be, I think, more inclined to trust Him in areas in your own life. Now, you're going to hear me say God, okay? And I know that's not His name. It's a title, right? I also will sometimes I might use the Hebrew phrase Hashem, which means the name, or I'll refer to Him as the Holy One. So what I like to do is I've been studying the ancient Near East since 2014, and for the past about 4 years I've been teaching on this. And what I like to do is to get people hooked, like me, on studying the ancient cultures of Torah. And it's not because I think we have to think like we're supposed to think like the ancients, but it's because God introduced Himself to the ancients using, language and customs and idioms and metaphors and stories of their time, not ours, right? So let me give you an example of how important it is to kind of culturally translate the biblical text so that we can know what the original audience meant, right? Okay, let's say you've got a friend visiting you from London, and they were to say to you, "I'm knackered. I'm going up the apples and pears, up the wooden hill to Bedfordshire. But first, I'm off to spend a penny." All right? So what do you think that means? What are they trying to say? Now, with the exception of the word knackered, all the other words, we know what those are, right? Well, it turns out that in order to understand what your friend is saying, you've got to culturally translate this, okay? So what your friend is actually trying to say to you is, "I'm exhausted. I'm walking up the stairs to go to bed. But first, I'm off to the bathroom." Isn't that crazy? It's quite a bit different from how you thought, right? So, we need to know the cultural cues behind what we're being told. And this same principle is true for this ancient Israelite Bible that was not originally written to us, but it certainly is for us. A lot of the Bible is misunderstood by us today because we all kind of have this ingrained tendency to view things through the lens of our own lives and culture. We don't get outside of our own worldview and our beliefs long enough to recognize that ours isn't the only way to be. Now, this is true when looking at other modern cultures around us, but also definitely when looking at ancient ones. In fact, most of us start out believing that the ancients of Bible times thought like we do. Now, this isn't to say that you have to be an ancient Near East scholar to understand the Bible, because God's Spirit illuminates the words and brings meaning to them for our lives. But what I mean is that God introduces Himself to the ancients using what they believed about how the world worked. That's how He introduced Himself. He contrasted Himself to the gods of the world at the time, those gods and stories and cultures that you and I are very much removed from. And we really don't know what we don't know. But stick with me through this Torah cycle, and I think you're going to pick up a great deal of understanding. We're in the beautiful book of Genesis, or Bereshit. And we're in the very first Torah portion for the year, also called Bereshit, which mainly we'll find it translated in the beginning. And really, I can't think of a better place to start pulling ancient Near East tidbits for you than in this very first sentence of this very first book of the Bible. I'm going to say A-N-E instead of ancient Near East because it's easier to say A-N-E. So that's what I'm saying when you hear me say that. So we have the very first sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I'm going to read it in Hebrew. I don't read Hebrew, so this is a transliteration. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Okay? Now, I picked this out as our very first lesson because I think it can set the stage for something that you'll hear me say over and over again. The ancients did not think like we do. And God met them in their understanding, not ours. So there's this famous phrase among those who study the A&E. The Bible was not written to us, moderns, but it was written for us. So the first thing that I want to show you is what the ancients would have understood this very first sentence of Genesis to mean. Because it's different than how most of us see it. Okay? So I'm going to hone in on three words here: heavens, earth, and created. We're going to spend the most time on the word created, so I'll present that one last. All right? So Hebrew is an interesting language in that there's far fewer words in Hebrew than there are in English. So what this means is that Hebrew is an elastic language. One word can have multiple meanings. So translators need to look at the context to determine the best meaning, to pick which word is going to be translated into English, right? And translators should ask, well, how did the ancients view this word, or how did the ancients view this situation? What was their cultural context, right? And if you would ask an ancient, one of the things that you'd know is they were interested in what they could see when they looked around them. Okay, they weren't. When you think about what questions Genesis answers, you have to also go back and think what was the question, right? And the ancients wouldn't have been asking or looking or thinking about how the entire universe, the part they can't see, how that was formed, like us moderns are interested in. They wanted to know about the things that they could see, like the sky above and the earth below. Okay? So we have Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Again, we know this as in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Hashamayim could mean heavens, but it can also mean the sky. Haaretz could also mean, or can mean the earth, but it, like, think of our globe, you know. But it could also mean the land. And Bereshit, which we know as in the beginning, it can also mean when at first. Interesting, right? So a very valid translation from the worldview of the ancients can be when at first God created the skies and the land. Now, I want to hone in on the word created. And I want you to start thinking, could there be more to the meaning of created than our modern Western eyes can see? Or another way of asking this is, what did the ancients think of this word, right? So the Hebrew word for created is bara, and it's used 54 times in the Tanakh, and 11 of those times are in Genesis, the book of Genesis. So what's interesting here is that the God of Israel is almost always, with the exception of two places, almost always the subject of the verb. God is always the one doing the bara'ing, right? So we have Joshua 17:15 and 17:18, which is talking about the same subject, and those are the only two exceptions. And that has to do with something that the people are doing, shaping the land. They're creating, in those verses, they're creating space by cutting down trees in the forest and living there. Okay? Now, one thing I'd love for you to do is to keep a running list of the A&E scholars whose work I'll be introducing you to each week. The first name to encounter is a big heavy hitter, Dr. John Walton. And his name is the one who's associated with my favorite quote, "The Bible wasn't written to you, but it's written for you." So he is a professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College. And his name is a name that you'll hear me mention many, many times. Now, you're not going to agree with everything that he says. And I don't agree with everything he says. And you're not going to agree with everything I say. But that's okay, right? But Dr. Walton is solid in his research. He's written a series of books that I highly recommend. It's the Lost World series. He's got, I think, 6 in the series. The Lost World of Genesis 1, Lost World of Adam and Eve, Lost World of the Israelite Conquest, Lost World of Torah. I think that's 4. There's 6 in total. Anyway, so John Walton. He says that Hebraically, the word bara means to fatten or to fill up. So in Genesis 1:1, it means that the heavens and the earth, or maybe the sky and the land, right, are filled up with purpose. It means to organize. Now, the etymological dictionary of biblical Hebrew has bara meaning to emerge from constraints. And if you would like to dig deeper, we don't have time here, but you can look up each use of the word bara to see that it does actually, in each case, it speaks of function, it speaks of organizing, and it speaks of purpose. And in none of those cases of the word bara does it mean material creation. Interesting, right? So if we're trying to understand what the ancients thought of this word bara, we can know 2 things. We can know that it was God's domain and it had the sense of assigning function, not material making. So the next thing that you need to know is this idea of purpose or function. That was a big deal in the A&E. In fact, to the ancient mind, function and existence went hand in hand. So another scholar that you'll hear me share from is Dr. Skip Moen. He's a word scholar and has developed courses and a number of books. And he's lectured on aspects of the A&E culture of Torah. And here's a quote from him talking about this idea that existence equals function. He says, in Hebrew, something exists because it fulfills a function. It does not exist simply because it occupies space and time. Unless something has purpose or acts according to design, it has no existence. Greek thinking is just the opposite. Now, side note here, we moderns are more Greek thinkers, okay? So back to his quote. Something exists because it occupies space and time. It does not need to have purpose or be part of a design in order to exist. Okay? So this this belief that function equals existence, it's actually reflected in the Hebrew language. And we can see this when we see the central role that function plays over form, what it does versus how it looks, when it relates to Hebrew nouns. Nouns name objects, right? So I'm going to talk just a little bit about nouns because this speaks to how ancient Hebrews thought, all right? So Hebrew language is what we call a very concrete and action-oriented language. And even the nouns describe how something functions rather than how it looks. So that's, again, function over form. And we can contrast that with English because a noun describes how it looks, the physical form, right? That's what gives it the meaning. So I have this example in my Genesis book. If you were to picture the word chair, what would that chair look like? Not the word, with the letters, but what, picture a chair in your mind, right? Did you picture a particular kind of chair? Maybe it was like a dining room chair, one with wooden handles, or maybe one of those big upholstered, overstuffed ones, right? So if you visualize a type of chair in your mind, that's an idea of conceptualizing a noun by the way that it looks. So that's form, right? A chair is how it looks. But interesting that the ancient Hebrews, they would have pictured someone sitting in a chair, because to the ancient mind, a chair is what it does, right? So ancients thought in very concrete ways, and words were associated with something that could be sensed by one of the five senses. So objects were named by how they functioned, not what they looked like. Nouns all come from a verb root that represents an action, something that's concrete. And English, on the other hand, is a very abstract language. So if we are only thinking like an English speaker, then we're going to miss out on what the message was that was first delivered to the ancients, right? So here's an example of the difference between an abstract English word and the Hebrew counterpart, which is concrete, okay? Anger in English, af in Hebrew. So af means anger. Now, when you think about the word anger, it's kind of abstract, right? It's hard to like pin it down, hard to conceptualize it. But in Hebrew, af is the word for nose or nostril, right? So think of this. When a person gets angry, the nostrils are flaring. And that's very concrete. So it's easier to see the function and purpose and the importance of that in a given word when you look at it concretely, right? Again, function, purpose. That was a huge deal in the A&E. So let's get back to in the beginning, God created, right? We could say it this way, that the ancients would have understood this to be when at first God brought function, purpose to the sky and the land, okay? Now, they thought in terms of functional creation, not material creation, like how we are assuming it means. God using materials that he had already created to assign function, opposed to talking about him actually building things materially. Now, let me say this because I want to clear up, right off the bat, I want to clear up any misunderstandings or something that you might be wondering about at this point. The ancients would have assumed that at some point in the past, before the events of this Genesis passage, that God created the material world in the sense of how we moderns think of the word create, okay? So John Walton, he gives this great analogy of a play in a theater, all right? So think of Genesis, Genesis 1, as a play at the theater. Now, when the curtain comes up, there's a set already on stage, right? And it's populated by characters. And the only information that we have about these characters is what we're seeing once the play begins, right? From that point in time on. So by the time that the curtain comes up in Genesis 1, God's already created the materials, or the set, so to speak, right? And what we're learning about now is what he does to bring organization and order and function to those things. And then, as we read on, we learn that the sky and the land originally, or heavens and earth, originally had no function, no purpose. And that's actually the meaning behind that Hebrew phrase, tohu vavohu. That's what we translate formless and void, or formless and empty, in Genesis 1:2. So Hebraically, tohu vavohu better means chaotic and disorganized. Now, a little side note here, Jeremiah uses that same phrase, tohu vavohu, to describe the land of Israel after the Babylonians had destroyed the land and exiled many of the inhabitants. It's really interesting. And then there's other places in Scripture that use the same phrase. And in all those cases, it means that material things are in need of an organizer, or they're in need of purpose or function. So it's really interesting. Okay, so back in Genesis, the sky, the land, the heavens and the earth, purposeless, and then God steps in to organize or to bring function to the sky and the land. So it says he hovers over the face of the deep, and he brought purpose to each aspect of creation, including mankind, right? So again, to the ancient mind, the actions of Genesis 1:1 and 2 is about bringing purpose to what had already been made. Now, before, if this is something completely new to you, before you panic that your whole worldview is being disrupted, because this is so different from how you've been taught, right? I want you to stay with me, because the reason I'm bringing this up, there's a really good message in what I'm saying. And it's something that the ancients would have been able to understand about God, but we can't unless we see it through ancient eyes, right? So if you're not used to seeing through ancient eyes, it's easy to miss how astounding this message was to the original audience, that this Elohim of Israel is the one who creates purpose and function for the world that the ancients can see. Okay, so here's what we've learned so far. The scriptures tie bara with God. To the ancient mind, function and existence went hand in hand. So the last piece that I want you to know is that the ancients never considered the multiple gods that they served to have ever brought function and purpose to anything. That was not thought of as the domain of these gods. Okay? So what we're being told in the first part of Genesis is that only this one, the God of the Hebrews, has this kind of power or ability. And that's what we're getting at the very start of an introduction of who God is, right? So it's this declarative statement that God stands alone over all the other gods. And for the ancients who lived in this very polytheistic culture, that would have been amazing, astounding, a powerful message, a powerful way for the God of Israel to introduce himself to them. Now, we in modern times, we look at Genesis as a science book, and when we're off digging in those weeds over there, we miss the astounding introduction that God's giving, that he gave to the ancients, and that is for us too, right? The ancients were looking for something entirely different, not a science book on the origin of things. They needed something else to meet their needs. So God's very first introduction of himself assured them that he's the one who brings purpose to this world of his. That is existence in the mind of the ancients. And the ancients, they desperately needed that message, and so do we, right? Because purpose has been lacking in many people's lives, modern or otherwise. So right off the bat, we're being introduced to a God who brings purpose to his created things. And this idea of purpose, identity, right? That's one of the themes that I'm going to be exploring with you in the series, how God brings purpose in his family. But we'll be looking at it from how did the ancients view it, right? So, even in this very first words of this Torah portion, Bereshit, it tells us we're here for a purpose, right? And then in the later chapters of Genesis, and then certainly in Exodus and beyond, this, what is this purpose? Well, that unfolds, and we get to learn what that is, right? So what the ancients knew, and now you can know, is that God shapes you toward purpose. And that's not just a feel-good message. And that's not just a cool ancient Near East message, right? It has real implications for us. Because when we know that from the very get-go, God says that I'm the God of purpose, you know, we don't have to define ourselves any longer by our past mistakes when we were living like that tohu vavohu, that formless and empty life, right? We can know right off the bat that we were created with a purpose. Basically we're saved from tohu vavohu in our lives, and our lives are filled with meaning and purpose as God's family. And we all have the same overall purpose. That's what we would call fruitfulness. But each of us get to work that out in individual ways, right? And that's going to be flavored by our unique personalities that we're given, our abilities, our strengths, our challenges, our weaknesses, and the settings that we find ourselves in, right? So, as we're coming to the end of this lesson, when you know that in Messiah, God has created you with purpose and function, I want you to get the idea, just really have it soak in, that you don't need to think poorly of yourself, right? We are vessels of honor, and our identity is honorable because that's inherent in our purpose. And it's God who's given us our purpose, right? So, as an encouragement, I want you, and I pray that you will remember the God of Bara next time that you want to treat yourself harshly for your past when you were walking in tohu vavohu. And I want you to remember the God of Bara the next time you stumble in your walk and you wonder, should I pick myself up and try it again, right? I pray that you'll trust these, even though I might have blown your mind a little bit, I pray that you'll trust these opening lines of Genesis the way that the ancients would have heard it, that God really does, and He alone has the power to bara, meaning and purpose in all things, including those seemingly wrecked things, right, of our lives. So in the beginning, God created you. And in your new beginning, God gave you function and purpose. Truly, truly, and you'll hear, this is the theme that you'll hear throughout this whole series, there is none like our God. So I am already looking forward to next week's lesson with you. So until then, be blessed.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.